The last dragon had no home, until a human woman refused to let go. Before we start the story, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. This story was written for every soul who ever refused to give up on something the world had already buried. The Covenant of Worlds had a rule for everything. Rules for trade. Rules for war. Rules for which species deserved protection and which ones had already lived long enough. The bureaucrats who wrote those rules sat in climate-controlled chambers on Vale Station, orbiting a star so old it had forgotten how to burn bright. They drafted their policies in triplicate and stamped them with seals that meant nothing to the dying. Commander Mara Solen had read every one of those rules. She had followed most of them. But she had been born on a cattle farm in rural Kansas, raised by a grandmother who said that a rule written by a man who never suffered was a rule written in sand, and sand washed away. Mara was 43 years old, silver-threaded hair pulled back tight, 3 decades of service stitched into the lines around her eyes. She commanded the deep-range salvage vessel Iron Will, a ship that had no business being beautiful and somehow was anyway, all scavenged plating and jury-rigged sensor arrays, held together by ingenuity and a crew that trusted each other with their lives. They had been mapping the Ashvale Corridor, a graveyard stretch of collapsed trade routes, when the distress signal hit their array. Not a Covenant frequency. Not any registered species. Just a raw, biological pulse. The kind of sound a living thing made when it had been screaming so long it no longer expected anyone to answer. Location. Mara asked. Her navigator, a young man named Dov, pulled up the coordinates. His face went still. Inside the Dracthar debris field, Commander. The old dragon homeworld. The Dracthar. Mara knew the name. Everyone in the corridor knew it. The Covenant had classified the Dracthar ascendancy as extinct 11 years ago. Casualties of the Pale Silence, a biological weapon deployed during a border war the Covenant preferred not to discuss in public records. An entire species. Gone. The homeworld reduced to rock and radiation and floating wreckage that other ships gave wide berth, partly out of caution and partly out of something older than policy, something that felt like shame. Someone's alive in there, Dov said quietly. The crew waited. Mara felt the weight of it, not just the signal but the silence around the signal. The Covenant would say it was residual. Equipment malfunction. A ghost in the frequency. They would say it because acknowledging it meant acknowledging responsibility, and the Covenant had not built its power by welcoming that kind of conversation. Mara stood up from her chair. Bring us in, she said. The debris field was a cemetery that hadn't finished falling. Massive fragments of Dracthar architecture drifted in slow collision. Obsidian towers split in half, ceremonial arches still intact despite everything, hull plating from warships that had been enormous even by galactic standards. The Dracthar had been large creatures. Their scale was everywhere in the wreckage and the scale made the silence worse. Mara suited up herself. Her crew chief, a broad-shouldered woman named Tom, tried to argue. Protocol says. Protocol didn't pick up the signal, Mara said, sealing her helmet. I did. They took the boarding skiff in slow and careful, navigating by hand through corridors of wreckage that could shift without warning. Radiation levels were elevated but survivable. Their suits could handle 4 hours. Mara intended to need less. The signal led them to the hollowed shell of what had once been a Dracthar nursery vessel, smaller than the warships designed for carrying young. Most of it was destroyed. One section held atmosphere, barely, sealed by a structural accident that had somehow created an air pocket inside the ruin. Mara cut through the outer wall herself. Inside, curled in the far corner against a nest of insulation torn from the walls, was a dragonling. She had seen images of adult Dracthar in Covenant archives. 12 meters long, scaled in deep crimson and black, with eyes like molten copper and intelligence in every line of their faces. This one was perhaps the size of a large dog. Its scales were dull, gone pale at the edges from malnutrition. 3 of its 4 wings were folded tight against its body. The 4th was broken, held awkward and wrong against the floor. It looked at Mara with eyes that were too old for something so small. It did not growl. It did not flinch. It had been alone long enough that it had moved past fear into something quieter and more devastating. A resignation that living things should never carry. Mara crossed the room and knelt down. Hey, she said softly. I've got you. The dragonling stared at her. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a creature that had learned not to trust quickly and was choosing to anyway, it pressed its head against her gloved hand. Tom, standing in the cut doorway, said nothing for a long moment. Commander, she finally managed. The Covenant has a Class 4 restriction on Dracthar biological material. If they find out Then we make sure they don't find out, Mara said. Not yet. She lifted the dragonling, gently supporting the broken wing, and carried it back to the iron will. They named him Kale. Not as a permanent name. Mara wasn't sure what the Drakthar naming traditions were, and she intended to find out, but as something to call him while he learned that food appeared regularly now and no one was going to leave him alone in the dark again. He took to it quickly, the way young things take to anything that means safety. His wing healed crooked. Their ship's medic, a careful man named Prast who had trained on 3 different worlds, did what he could with the materials available. The result was functional. Kale could fly after a fashion in short bursts, but the wing would always carry the signature of what had happened to him. Prast said that quietly, and Mara nodded, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that Kale already knew that. He had stopped favoring it the moment it became clear he was expected to use it. He was intelligent in ways that made the crew slightly uncomfortable at first and then deeply respectful. Within 6 weeks, he understood their spoken language well enough to respond to direct questions by positioning himself or manipulating objects. Within 3 months he had learned to use a modified interface Dov had built for him, a simplified communication board that he operated with startling precision. His first complete sentence, assembled letter by patient letter, was, "Why did they stop coming?" Mara sat with him for a long time after that. She told him the truth, not the sanitized Covenant version, but what she had pieced together from restricted records and testimony from corridor traders who had been in the region during the Pale Silence. She told him that his people had been caught in a war that was not theirs. That the weapon used against them had been deployed by parties who had since restructured their names and their alliances and continued doing business as usual. Kale listened. His copper eyes did not look away. "Are they punished?" "No," Mara said. His tail moved slowly against the floor. Then he typed, "You are angry about this?" "Yes," she said. "So am I," he typed. Then after a pause, "What do we do?" That was the question that changed everything. Because Mara had been asking it quietly for 11 years, since she first read the classified summary of the Pale Silence and realized the Covenant's neutrality was not neutrality at all. It was complicity dressed in policy language. And she had done nothing because she was one woman on a salvage vessel with no political standing and no proof that would survive a Covenant review board. But Kale was proof. Kale, alive, was the Covenant's worst administrative nightmare. Evidence that their extinction declaration was false, that the biological weapon had not completed its function, and that someone had known enough about the nursery vessel's location to leave it unsealed rather than destroyed. Which meant the Pale Silence had been monitored. Which meant someone had watched. Mara started building a case. She was methodical about it. She had grown up watching her grandmother keep meticulous records of every transaction on that Kansas farm, because her grandmother had learned early that when institutions tried to take what was yours, the only weapon that lasted was documentation. Mara had inherited that discipline and applied it to 3 decades of Covenant irregularities she had quietly catalogued without knowing exactly what she was building toward. Now she knew. She contacted 3 journalists embedded in independent networks outside Covenant jurisdiction. She reached out to 2 former Covenant legal advisors who had left under circumstances that suggested conscience rather than comfort. She compiled Kale's biological data, the nursery vessel's coordinates, the timeline of the extinction declaration versus the actual signal date, and every cross-reference she could extract from public Covenant records. Then she made one mistake. She trusted the wrong relay node. Someone flagged the transmission. And 3 weeks later, a Covenant enforcement vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly in the Ironwill's path. The enforcement vessel was called Measured Response. Mara thought that was the most Covenant name she had ever heard. Its commander, Executor Haln, was a Velic, long-limbed, silver-skinned, with the particular expression of someone who had been given a distasteful task and intended to complete it efficiently. He opened communication immediately. "Commander Solen. You are in possession of restricted biological material classified under Covenant Preservation Directive 7 null. You will prepare to surrender the organism and submit to review." Mara's crew looked at her. Kale, who had learned to read the room, stood very still near the navigation console where he had taken to spending his mornings. "The organism," Mara said, "has a name. Commander. His name is Kale. He is the last surviving member of a species your directive claims is extinct. Which means your directive is either wrong or fraudulent. Either way, I don't think you want to make this confrontation part of the public record." Haln's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "You have no authority to determine." "I have 3 independent journalists with copies of my compiled documentation," Mara said. I have 2 former legal advisors who have reviewed it and confirmed its validity under the Interstellar Accord on Species Continuity, which the Covenant signed and has never formally withdrawn from. If you board this vessel and remove Kale, every piece of that documentation goes live within the hour. And the question that every Covenant member species will be asking is not why I broke Directive 7 null. She paused. The question will be why the Covenant declared a species extinct while a survivor was still transmitting. The channel stayed open. Holmes said nothing. Mara kept her voice level. I'm not your enemy, Executor. I'm the person giving you the chance to handle this quietly, correctly, and in a way that doesn't end careers, including yours. I'm proposing formal species continuity proceedings under the Accord. Kale gets protected status. The Pale Silence gets a proper inquiry. And the Iron Will gets to keep flying. Another silence. Then, you have prepared for this conversation. I'm from Kansas, Mara said. We prepare for everything. It took 4 hours of negotiation. Dov passed Mara coffee twice. Kale sat beside her chair for the entire duration and did not move, his copper eyes fixed on the view screen with an attention that the crew would talk about for years. The last Dracthar watching a human woman argue for his existence with the same calm precision his species had once used to navigate the stars. Haln finally said, I will recommend the proceedings. I cannot guarantee the outcome. I know, Mara said. Guarantee is above your pay grade. Recommendation is enough. The species continuity proceedings took 14 months. Mara testified 11 times. Her documentation was challenged, audited, cross-referenced, and challenged again. 2 Covenant officials resigned during the inquiry rather than answer questions under oath. The journalists published everything in stages, precisely timed to maintain pressure without giving the Covenant a single clean moment to redirect the narrative. The former legal advisors argued the Accord provisions with a precision that made Haln, who attended every session, visibly uncomfortable with his own institution. Kale testified once. He stood before the Covenant review panel, 12 species represented, some of them old enough to remember the Dracthar ascendancy in its full power, and he communicated through his interface with the same deliberateness he had used from the beginning. He did not speak of suffering. He did not perform grief for the panel's benefit. He told them, in simple and exact language, what he remembered of the nursery vessel. The smell of it before the air went bad, the sound of the other young ones, the long silence after. And then he told them what he had observed aboard the Iron Will over 14 months of living among humans. They argue, he said. They make mistakes. They are afraid of things and do them anyway. When they find something broken, they do not ask if it is worth fixing. They just begin. The chamber was very quiet. I do not know if my people can come back, Kale continued. I do not know if there are others like me, hidden somewhere the weapon did not reach. But I know that the question is worth asking. And I know who taught me that. He looked at Mara. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away. The Covenant granted Kale protected status under the Species Continuity Accord. The Pale Silence inquiry was formally opened, a process that would take years and implicate parties who had considered themselves permanently insulated from consequence. The Iron Will was cleared of all directive violations, a decision rendered in language so carefully neutral it practically radiated institutional embarrassment. 3 months after the ruling, a signal came in from the far edge of the Ashvale corridor. Not equipment. Not residual. Biological. 2 signals. Then 4. Then 9. Mara sat in her chair and felt something she hadn't let herself feel through 14 months of testimony and documentation and careful, relentless preparation. She felt it rise in her chest like something that had been waiting a long time for permission. Kale stood beside her. He had grown, not to adult scale yet, but larger, his scales deepening toward the crimson that the archive images had shown. His broken wing moved with a slight hitch when he extended it, the healed crookedness permanent and unremarkable, worn the way all survivors wore their damage, as proof of endurance rather than evidence of failure. He looked at the signals on the screen. Then he looked at her. We go, he typed. We go, Mara said. The Iron Will turned toward the edge of the corridor, toward the 9 signals that were still transmitting, toward whatever came next, and it moved with the particular confidence of a ship that had already survived what it wasn't supposed to survive, crewed by people who had learned long ago that the only rule worth following was the one her grandmother had taught her on a Kansas farm. When the world says something is finished, you look closer. Because sometimes the world is wrong. And someone has to be willing to look. End of story. DracoWar, thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.